welcome to the virtual book launch for the book Creating Resilient Futures. It's a very timely week to be launching this book as COP22 is taking place in Scotland. There's a lot of attention and a lot at stake as global leaders meet and hopefully firm up real action to ensure resilient futures. Today we have an overview of the book by one of the editors, Stephen Flood, who works in environmental policy and social science research, an address by Helen, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, and three of our authors will give brief overviews of their chapters. Doug Cubie, who works in the areas of humanitarian action, international development, climate justice, and refugee protection. Yairen Columbié is Assistant Professor in the Department of Hispanic Studies and Deputy Director of the Centre for Global Intercultural Communications at Trinity College Dublin. And Adam Rogers, who works with the UN as a consultant and advisor and writes on responsible travel and tourism and sustainable development. The book explores opportunities to address global challenges by developing resilience through building an integrated approach, by bringing together the agendas of climate change, adaptation, the Sustainable Development Goals, and disaster risk reduction. By bringing together these areas, how can progress be better achieved instead of through siloed and independent agendas? Hopefully, the world leaders and other representatives attending COP26 can seek out such cooperation with different nations and sectors coming together to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Of course, the challenge to address crises such as climate change and COVID-19 will continue, and this book is an example of how different disciplines can work together to build much needed resilience. And now I'll hand over to Stephen Flood.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Appreciate that. Thanks for the introduction. And thanks everybody for joining today, panelists and speakers and attendees. I'll just share my screen here. Okay. Go into this mode. So you should all be able to see the overview of the event. So just as Jennifer explained, we're going to talk through three specific chapters in the text, and I'm going to give an overview of the book itself. And then we have time for discussion towards the close, about 25 minutes of discussion time. Helen Clark is going to join after I give my summary of the book, approximately at 10:15. So that's how we're working this morning. So thanks very much, everybody. The book itself, The Labor of Love, with a fantastic team effort from myself and our three co-editors on the book. I'd just like to give some thanks initially up front to the funding from the Environmental Protection Agency, a number of projects in the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the Interreg, European Interreg Climate Project, MPA project as well, provided funding towards open access for the book. And many of the chapters are drawn from EPA and that EPA projects and also that Interreg project as well. I'd also like to thank ConnectAid and Adam for pushing and promoting the book on social media over the last week or so as well. So that's fantastic and greatly appreciated. The book is looking at building coherence building opportunities essentially between these three agendas, all took place or were formed in 2015. So climate change adaptation, Sustainable Development Goals, Global Agenda, and Disaster Risk Reduction, Sendai as well. And we're looking at opportunities to address how these global challenges of developing resilience as something that is integrated across a number of domains rather than, as is often the case, through independent and siloed agendas. A brief elevator summary is that what we're promoting here with the book is a message of hope. It's how we can connect and improve resilience outcomes by harnessing a range of ideas across a range of research communities, practitioner communities, and communities as well within our local communities. We're also looking to see if we can harness the ability and the capability to work together more closely to create more resilient future outcomes by connecting these different agendas together. The book structure itself, we set out a number of best practice approaches in the initial chapters in the book, followed by a number of Irish case study applications where we're connecting these three agendas, and that's followed by international case studies with the three agendas from an international focus. We also today are going to present some of the lessons we've learned, overarching lessons, and some of the challenges and the potential solutions in terms of the integration of these agendas. So running through those best practice approaches, chapter by Letitia and White initially was looking at making connections through indicators around resilience, connecting these 3 different global agendas, setting out a lot of the themes that are within the book and the framing, the resilience framing within the book itself. This is followed by a chapter by Doug Cubie and Tomas Anatoli, which is going to be presented today in this overview in this online book launch. And this is looking at coherence, alignment, integration, and focusing on the legal relationship between sustainable development, climate change, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. And then finally, in terms of the best practice approach chapters, we look at how we can bridge the gap between connecting climate change risk assessments and disaster reduction in terms of climate change adaptation. And that's Shona Patterson and Kristen Guida. So that's our kind of framing of the book, is initially the conceptual framing, followed by a number of case study applications. So the case studies, starting with the Irish case studies, this is work funded by the Environmental Protection Agency and a project looking specifically at enhancing integration of disaster risk and climate change adaptation in Irish emergency planning. Often emergency planning is a key culprit of an area of a subject that's often siloed and not integrated across other domains. So this chapter specifically looks at how emergency planning within an Irish context can be integrated into climate change adaptation. And that's Peter Medway was working on that project along with myself, Doug Cubie and Martin Letitia. The second chapter looking at Irish case studies is a more locally focused chapter penned by Glenn Smith. This is again Irish EPA funded project, BCOMAR, the outcome of that project looking at supporting national climate change action in Ireland through local governance networks. So here we're zooming in and looking at the local in terms of how local communities and local governance can help to support national climate change action. Finally, in the Irish case studies, mainstreaming climate change adaptation into planning and development. So often planning is a way to operationalize climate change adaptation and sustainable development goals and also disaster risk. So this chapter looks at how you can mainstream climate change into existing planning and development in Northern Ireland. And this is a project, this is coming out of a project, the Interreg funded climate project, and Kathy Burns being the first author, myself, and then my former colleague Barry O'Dwyer of UCC. Moving to the international case studies, we had 4 chapters here, and the first is looking at a South African case study looking at small-scale fisheries, again connecting disaster risk, climate change adaptation, looking at bottom-up approaches of how these small-scale fishers can enact these different agendas. Merle Solomon and Xavier Rebello in South Africa. Our colleague Yairen, Jerez Columbié, is going to present today. Luckily, we have her on the line to present her chapter, looking at climate change, adapted to climate change to disaster risk in the Caribbean. And this chapter focuses on how there's lessons from the global south that we can take up and use in the global north as well in terms of integrating these agendas. Sui Kyong Wong and Gina Gariabula from Malaysia, from Borneo, presented a chapter looking at how to make river communities more resilient. And their case study was in Sarawak in Malaysia. And that's very much a community level focused case study of how this community is coping with development opportunities, and also while we're remaining resilient in the face of climate change impacts as well. And last but not least, our colleague Adam, who's on the line as well, Adam Rogers, is going to present his chapter in the book looking at reimagining our menu for sustainable development, where he works through a sequence of sustainable development goals, connecting them through with the agenda of sustainable food systems, which is very topical at the moment. That's just a kind of a very quick potted overview of the content of the book, and we're lucky we have chapter authors here to expand on a number of those chapters in greater detail. We also have time for discussion to tease out some of the issues raised in those chapters. In terms of overarching lessons learned that we gained from the book, what we found is that these agendas recognize resilience as an important feature or an integral feature of implementation and success. And it potentially provides a means of building linkages across these different agendas through using the development of tools that could be used to share targets and indicators across the agendas that we discussed. The agendas themselves address challenges to human security, to well-being, to environmental protection, etc., reducing impact, and they contribute to the creation of a framing for climate resilience, provided they're implemented in support of each other. So what we found a lot of the time was that the agendas don't necessarily talk with each other, they talk across each other. So that's something that we're going to discuss later with our chapter authors as well. And tools, transferable tools, can align these policies and manage these processes more effectively and try and break down these silos that have been characterized across these different domains. So that's the meat of the book in terms of what we're hoping it will achieve. I just have a number of challenges and a number of opportunities to kind of close out this summary piece. So challenges, which I think Doug and others will pick up on, is this balancing between autonomy and integration. So how can we maintain autonomy within agendas and also within across maybe national scales, but also integrate across more global scales? So that's a real challenge, and that came up across all our chapters and many of our chapters. Another more focus specific challenge was establishing data management that allows for integrations across these disciplines and topics. So some of that is data availability, also creating data in a useful format and coordinating across different agencies in terms of making data available. So there's huge potential with big data, et cetera, to do this, but it's a case of operationalizing data sharing and setting protocols in terms of sharing data. Aligned with this idea of data management is also consistency and agreement in terms of use of language and terminology. So there's a whole range of terminology and language used across sustainable development, climate change, and disaster risk, with common terms used that are often defined slightly differently. So I think we found a big part of the challenge and the opportunity is to look at creating consistent terms and coming to agreement as to what we're focusing on, and that's an important piece in the process. Furthermore, looking at using climate justice to frame global warming as an ethical and political issue is seen here as a challenge, but it's also, I think, an opportunity. And we have the COP currently taking place in Glasgow, and this climate justice loss and damage issue is central to many of the discussions, and I think it's an important way to frame the work that we've been doing as well. To iterate that point on this idea of avoiding silos, so policies and plans and agendas are often developed in an iterative, but often focused quite narrowly. So issues are dealt with one at a time. Departments, in terms of government departments, often deal with specific issues, and it's a real challenge to try and actually connect and break down this silo, the current siloed approach. And it was identified across the case studies as well as something that's key to achieving more resilience outcomes is integration, as much as it can be managed. And some of the solutions or some of the things we need to consider if we're going to be successful, we need to recognize that risks have interdependencies and they cascade within and across different sectors, and they can't be addressed through any one agreement, but and also any one agency. So it's the idea that we need to really increasingly look at the cascading nature of risk across systems, and we cannot afford to silo and just look at our particular corner of expertise or interest without considering other areas as well if we're going to achieve resilience and achieve our goals. Furthermore, in terms of solutions, integration at domestic level can reduce this duplication. If we're integrating domestic, national level, we can reduce duplication and optimize the use of resources when we're sharing expertise at a more international level, and we can support coherence at an international level. I think all the chapters are going to touch, the chapters discussed today are also going to touch on this issue of coherence and integration. There's also the potential to to embed these agendas across local government under the banner of resilience. So using resilience framing as a target to decide how we will approach these different areas as the outcome that we're striving towards. So if local government is looking to achieve certain outcomes that fit within the SDGs, within disaster risk or with climate change adaptation, that they can use those agendas to achieve resilience outcomes. Our fourth challenge of 5 is looking at how the role of local communities, covered in the chapter as well. So local communities working with NGOs and other partners have a lot of knowledge on the ground and a lot of expertise, and they have the practical knowledge and also practical proposals for dealing with and adapting to climate change, promoting sustainable livelihoods. Finally, using transdisciplinary and decolonizing approaches to the 3 agendas. It links in again with this piece on climate justice and integrating knowledge from these early adopters in the global south that Yairen is going to speak directly to in her chapter. So finally, the book is available now online as a free open access book through the link here, and the link will be shared. It has been shared on social media, and it'll be shared widely on LinkedIn and other platforms as well. So here's the link to access the book. I note that Helen Clark has joined us. That's fantastic. And also you can buy the book as well if you wish to get a hard copy or a softback covered copy. And there's a discount code at the top of this slide here. So if you note that discount code down, you can get a discount up to the end of the year of 20%. And again, this code and these details will be forwarded after the talk as well. So that's my summary and my details. I'll just stop sharing my screen and we can see if we can bring in Helen as a panelist. So I've just changed you into a panelist there, Helen, so that should work. So I'll leave it back to Jennifer. Thank you.
I'm handing over now to Helen Clark, who's going to give an address.
Thanks, everyone. Sorry, I haven't had time to change the backdrop, but great to be here to support the launch of the book. I was at the UN in 2015, leading the UN Development Programme, when these 3 great agendas of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Paris Agreement on climate change, and the Sustainable Development Goal agenda were all agreed. There hasn't been a year quite like it since for such big agendas. And yet, as we know, these big agendas tend to be done in stovepipes. So the people who negotiate the disaster risk reduction one aren't necessarily across the SDGs and vice versa, or are either of them necessarily connected to the negotiations around an agreement on climate. And so a volume which looks at how to build the coherence and interactions across these agendas, which is so obvious really, but it's a very, very timely and important volume, because we need to see these as a continuum of issues and challenges, not as independent and siloed agendas. The Global Risk Report of 2021 highlighted the portfolio of risks which could reshape our world in the coming years. And of course, global risk assessments have rightly for a long time been dominated by the climate crisis risks. But living through this ghastly experience of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've had first-hand experience of how a risk that materializes in our face can disrupt our societies and our economies so fundamentally. And in so doing, it's highlighted the impact of existing inequalities at the global and national levels, and it's given us insights into the scope and scale of cascading socio-ecological impacts of the challenges that we face. On climate, the scientific evidence is clear that our climate system is changing, and that there are very severe impacts on our planet and on our societies at large, impacts including major species and habitat loss, including damage to ecosystems and the support services they provide, damage to our infrastructure, our agriculture, our trade systems, and the likely displacement of human populations and resultant substantial economic losses. Go back to 2006 and Nick Stern's landmark report for the British government, which emphasised that the benefits of strong and early action on climate change always outweigh the costs. I think he had a phrase something like pay now or pay more later. And it valued the cost of inaction on climate at 5% of global GDP a year, ad infinitum. That's big. So we need systemic transformation to address the interlinked nature of the challenges we face. We've seen how the pandemic has generated unprecedented challenges across our societies and economies, causing us to upend conventional practices and behaviours. And now we face the challenge of building forward better and transitioning to a more resilient future. And in a lot of discussion about the Great Reset, which really should happen post-COVID, people are pointing to both the need for a more inclusive and more resilient and more sustainable future. So we're at a moment in time when we can think about these things. We can think outside the box. We could catalyse different actions. This opportunity, by the way, won't hang around. It won't knock twice. This is a time to be captured and not let slip through our fingers. Now, COP26 has been underway in Glasgow in recent days and is an opportunity to take stock of the magnitude of the climate challenge. Back in 2009, Copenhagen, the high-income countries, promised to work towards raising $100 billion for every year by 2020 to support developing countries to tackle climate change. Well, the last figures I saw hadn't been met, and of course, the pandemic can be partly blamed, I suppose, for a year's delay, but not for more. It's now incumbent on the high-income countries to demonstrate they can meet that target and surpass it, and that could include by building new markets for adaptation and mitigation and improving access to finance to support communities around the world to take action. Furthermore, if we're serious about the Paris Agreement ambition to limit global temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees and about adapting to the already evident impacts of climate change, we just have to change the way we look after our land, our seas, our waters, and how we grow our food. And this is also important if we want to protect and restore the world's biodiversity on which all life depends. At COP26, the UK presidency has stated its intention to work with partners to take forward action on protecting and restoring forests and critical ecosystems, and to champion the transition towards sustainable, resilient, and nature-positive agriculture. The COP is also to focus on finalising the rules needed to implement the Paris Agreement, the so-called Paris Rulebook. But just finalising the rules won't do it, will it? I mean, we're at the start of a decisive decade running through to 2030. We have to turn ambition, have to raise ambition and then turn raised ambition into action. And we're going to need action across government, across private sector, across civil society to work together for the transformations that are required. Now, it's important to link that agenda to implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, which have been dealt a very severe blow by the pandemic. The human development section of the goals has been struck pretty hard. And not surprising that in 2020, for the first time since the SDGs were adopted in 2015, the global average SDG index score had dropped from the previous year, a decline driven to a large extent by increased poverty, hunger, and other regressions in human development following the outbreak of the pandemic. Moreover, the decline in SDG performance globally is likely underestimated as often it takes time for indicators to come through. We won't have full information for some time. COVID-19 has highlighted the limited capacity of low-income countries, and indeed low-middle-income countries, to tap into market financing. While the governments of high-income countries have borrowed heavily in response to the pandemic, low-income countries are constrained because of lower credit worthiness. The major short-term implication of the difference of fiscal space between the high-income and low-income countries is that the rich countries are likely to recover from the pandemic more quickly than the poor countries. And let me add in brackets here, damn hard to recover when you have inequitable access to vaccines, which is one of the most shocking aspects of the global response to the pandemic. Pandemics also underline the need to accelerate progress towards SDG targets like universal health coverage and universal access to key infrastructure, including the digital infrastructure. Responses to the pandemic have been greatly hampered where people don't have access to connectivity, to continue education, to get remotely delivered health care attention, and so on. Despite progress on the Statistical Performance Index globally since 2015, we need more investments to strengthen statistical capacities in many low-income countries and SIDS, and for more forward-looking policy trackers to assess implementation on key SDG transformations and monitor country actions across the dimensions of the SDGs. On disaster risk, the focus of the Sendai framework, it doesn't accrue overnight. It accrues in systems, institutions, and communities because of lack of knowledge of hazards and risk, increasing exposure as a result of risk-blind decision-making, investment and construction, and vulnerabilities entrenched by structural inequality and discrimination. The entrenchment of vulnerabilities in social, economic, and environmental systems driving development continues until a crisis erupts due to a shock or accumulated stress which overwhelms capacities and ripples through a system. As societies struggle to manage risks and recover from the impacts of the pandemic and from concurrent disasters, whether it be desert locust swarming in East Africa, heat waves, tropical storms, fires, disaster risk reduction provides an important entry point for refocusing attention on the need to reduce existing risks, build back better and equip states and communities with the tools they need to prevent the creation of new risks. When I was at UNDP and preparing for Sendai, we coined the phrase, if it's not risk-informed, it's not sustainable development. This is the critical importance of linking these agendas. The UN system's long partnered with countries to reduce risks and implement the global frameworks on disaster risk reduction. The UN Plan of Action on DRR towards a risk-informed and integrated approach to sustainable development presents the commitments of the UN system itself to support countries in implementing the Sendai framework and to promote risk-informed development. Under that framework, governments have the primary responsibility, and stakeholders and partners a shared responsibility to prevent and reduce disaster risk. The underlying principle must be that all of society engagement and partnerships are required to implement risk management measures and advance disaster risk reduction. This edited book's linked up approach, I think, helps join the dots for researchers, policymakers, and practitioners who are interested in developing and delivering outcomes across disaster risk reduction, climate change challenges, and sustainability. As I said, there's a small window of opportunity now to capitalize on global goodwill, scientific understanding of the problems, and policy momentum. And the book's case studies have useful and usable information to inform solutions and showcase the value of science in mediating choices, identifying synergies and trade-offs, and highlighting options for better policies for inclusive social development and resilient livelihoods. The volume has a rich array of practical lessons and engaged research frameworks looking at how to integrate these agendas. And what's striking from all the chapters is the complexity of taking meaningful action to address what are truly global challenges. However, the findings also indicate how much potential there is from integration as a means of breaking out of our disciplinary silos and sharing and expanding on the synergies between these agendas and moving towards more holistic approaches. In doing so, we could reduce vulnerability and enhance resilience. Coherence in approaches is needed to place the assessment of climate change and disaster risk reduction in this wider context of sustainable development outcomes. So in conclusion, I really do recommend the book as a great effort to bring the agendas together, bring the thinking together, look for win-win-wins across policy development and implementation. There's no one-size-fits-all, but a book like this offers so many rich possibilities for study as to how to make the most of these great agendas and moving forward on them. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Helen. And now we'll move on to each of the individual chapter authors who are with us today to introduce their individual sections. So first of all, if we have Yairen, if you can introduce your chapter for us, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you very much for the introduction. And can you hear me properly? I'm just double checking. Yes? Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to all the panelists, to Helen, Clark, and to the audience for joining us for this lunch. As an editor of the volume myself, I would like to thank all the contributors, the reviewers, the production team, and also my colleagues, Stephen, Martin Letizier, and Maria Doyer for their work on both the volume and on the edition of my chapter too. They helped with that. My chapter with focus on the Caribbean emerges from my work and experiences both on and in the region, as well as from a need for integrating subaltern epistemologies and practices into climate empowerment research in Europe. After carrying out interdisciplinary research in Irish and European projects, I realized that interdisciplinary environmental studies and climate change adaptation research in Europe are often disconnected from the knowledge accumulated by post-colonial communities in vulnerable territories, as well as from the arts and the humanities. So my chapter proposes using tools from regional and cultural studies to learn from vulnerable and resilient peoples as those in the Caribbean. It is well known that small island developing states, not only in the Caribbean, also in the Pacific and in Africa, have been pushed to develop resilience in conditions of extreme geophysical and geopolitical vulnerability. Small island developing states are at the forefront of global agendas for climate-related environmental challenges, as reflected in extant documentation of agreements endorsed by international organizations, such as the SIDS Accelerated Modalities of Action, the Samoa Pathway, the Paris Agreement, and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Nevertheless, there is still insufficient recognition in the academic literature of the valuable information provided by SIDS about climate change resilience across multiple countries and regions, and about how their knowledge can inform adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and sustainable development pathways at a global scale. So this absence of the SIDS knowledge in adaptation research discourses, which emerged in the mid-1990s, neglects small islands' leading role in raising awareness of climate change and implementing adaptation strategies ever since the 1980s. And here I would like to make a parenthesis to highlight how problematic it is to refer to these territories as developing states, although this is the nomenclature I use in the chapter. I bear in mind that assembling an informed global knowledge infrastructure to face climate change and support sustainable development requires operating outside the dominant models of classification and hierarchical delineations of the so-called developed countries. The UN has specified that designations developing, in transition, and developed are intended for statistical convenience, and they do not necessarily express a judgment about the stage reached by a particular country or area in the development process. However, discursively, these terms transcend the statistical arena and normalize and reify othering. They often enable unfair comparisons between countries with very different socio-historical contexts. And also, these terms obscure the causes of inequality. With this in mind, I propose to look at the experiential knowledge of Caribbean small island developing states in transnational cooperation through effective disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation initiatives in support of sustainable development. I analyzed some of the strategies and tools, as well as the impact of adaptation initiatives led by Caribbean countries through triangulation with international organizations and the European Union. The chapter draws mainly upon experiences reflected on reports and academic research in relation to the seeds, transference of knowledge and implementation of adaptive capacities with people across vulnerable communities. The chapter gathers lessons from the Caribbean that can be instructive at a global scale and provides some guidelines for the articulation of a theoretical framework for adaptation that translates into policies and action shaped by both the needs and the knowledge of vulnerable and resilient people. I focus on the African, Caribbean, and Pacific European Union Natural Disaster Risk Reduction Program, which was launched in 2011, and is an initiative of the African, Caribbean, Pacific Group of States, funded by the European Union. Bearing in mind the extreme vulnerability of the Caribbean to climate stressors and also the need for international cooperation, the Africa, Caribbean, Pacific, and EU program implements 3 strands of activities: regional and sub-regional level projects which support transnational cooperation, country level projects, and post-disaster capacity building and recovery activities to improve response capacity at long term too. The chapter illustrates through examples how all 3 strands of the program connect with interrelated sustainable development goals and support regional policies. And also, as part of this work of looking at the terms we use to describe reality and to find solutions, I echo research that interrogates the term natural disasters, bearing in mind that yes, disasters occur in nature and in relation to nature, but also pointing out that we need to understand the vulnerability of socio-ecological systems in relation to diverse socio-historical contexts. In the particular case of the Caribbean, although intra-regional variations are relevant, the territories of the region share a common environment and similar development challenges shaped by history. The vulnerability of the peoples from these regions is exacerbated by both its geophysical characteristics and its economic and in some cases also political dependence. Shaped this dependence by a long history of colonization, enslavement, imperialism, and extractivism, which have fueled industrialization processes in the global north and in consequence has supported global warming. So in light of the socio-historical causes of the inequalities framing differential vulnerability to climate change, researchers have been emphasizing that disasters are not so natural, that blaming nature and looking away from human-induced climate change and vulnerability poses obstacles to risk reduction, sustainable development, and both climate action and climate justice. The examples of South-South cooperation between SIDS and triangulation with Europe and international organizations included in the chapter show that a coherent and effective theoretical framework for impactful adaptation research and climate action in line with the Sustainable Development Goals should bring forward participatory, transdisciplinary, and translocal perspectives informed by the experiences of vulnerable communities in creating resilience to environmental challenges. The Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, one of the main results of the SIDS leadership in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation, recognizes regional platforms as critical mechanisms to monitor progress in adaptation implementation. The regional platforms studied in this chapter are playing a key role in the development of strategies and policies, and in the advancement also of knowledge and mutual learning at both regional and local levels. But notwithstanding the positive lessons provided by Caribbean efforts in creating resilience through horizontal cooperation, it is important to highlight that the alliances, experiences, initiatives, and policies studied in the chapter are limited by a dominant global development model that does not fully acknowledge the moral, material, and epistemic depth that the global north and or the ex-metropoles still owe to the global south or to post-colonial territories. In a context of global inequality, where the communities that were expropriated and enslaved are also the most affected by external debt and the most vulnerable to climate change, acknowledging the historical legacies of imperialism and colonialism is a prerequisite for saving and improving lives. Finally, whereas South-South cooperation and regional activities are vital for disaster risk reduction, I think that more effort should be put in communicating the socio-historical dimension of environmental vulnerability, historicizing resilience, and decolonizing both climate change, knowledge, and climate action. And the chapter aims to contribute to this purpose within the volume. I think that a decolonized global north, one that acknowledges the debt it acquired through slavery, colonialism, imperialism, could play an active role in shaping new sustainable development models through reparations and justice, and on horizontal, real horizontal cooperation. Transdisciplinary and decolonizing approaches to the three agendas offer opportunities for addressing climate justice challenges through the integration of the knowledge, the practices, the histories, and the voices of early adapters in post-colonial territories. And these can contribute to shape more coherent, more inclusive, and more equitable and effective responses to environmental challenges. I invite you to read the chapter, and I'm happy to welcome you and answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thanks, Yairen. And now we'll move on to Doug, and who will give an explanation of the chapter that he worked on.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jennifer. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to congratulate all the editors of this volume. I know a huge amount of work has gone into pulling together such a high quality range of chapters across so many disciplines. So congratulations. I was involved in this project because Stephen invited me and my colleague Tommaso Natoli to contribute a chapter looking at some of the legal issues. So looking at the integration or the interrelationship between climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and sustainable development from a legal perspective. And my colleague Tommaso Natoli, who was working here in UCC, was at the time undertaking a very detailed project in partnership with the disaster law program of the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. And Tommaso was undertaking fieldwork in Fiji, in the Philippines, in Dominica, in the Caribbean. So many crossovers with some of the topics that Yairen has just been talking about, looking at small island states, but looking very much from the perspective of the laws and policies that were being applied at the national and subnational levels. So for Tommaso and myself, we were starting from the perspective as lawyers to say, we have these three frameworks. Helen talked about the negotiations that led up to the 2015 agreement for the Sendai framework, the Paris Agreement, and the Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And these are international agreements which have been arisen through negotiation between states, non-governmental organizations, lobbying, advocacy, and so forth. But when we look at the three frameworks, there are differences between them from a legal perspective. At a very simple level, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change from 1992 and then the Paris Agreement are legally binding international agreements. So there's obligations that arise from states by signing up to them from a legal perspective. However, when we then look at the Sendai framework and the Sustainable Development Goals, these are non-binding in the sense that they're policy frameworks rather than hard law. So that was really the starting point that for Tommaso and myself, saying, well, what does this mean? And what is the relationship between these three different international frameworks? Because clearly they're all very authoritative, but is there a difference between the fact that some of them are legally binding and others aren't? And if we take Article 31.3c of the Vienna Convention on the Law of the Treaties, that examines the systemic integration of international law. So how international law as a comprehensive body can ensure that there aren't contradictions or discrepancies between international agreements that are signed. And what do you do? How do you resolve such problems if an issue arises? However, that only applies to binding international law. It doesn't apply to policy frameworks. So therefore, how do we understand this relationship between soft law, as would be classified, a policy framework such as the Sendai framework or the Sustainable Development Goals, and then a hard law framework such as the Paris Agreement? So that was really our starting point when we were looking at how can we discuss and understand the relationship between these two frameworks. And so we started by taking a textual analysis to say, well, what actually is the language that's used within the three frameworks? Because very interestingly, there are cross-references between them. You know, the Sustainable Development Goals cross-reference the Paris Agreement and the Sendai framework. Likewise, the Sendai framework cross-references the Paris Agreement. So there's clearly interconnections between these three different frameworks. But what does it mean? Because when we looked at the actual language that's used, both within the frameworks and then associated documents such as the Cancun Adaptation Framework or the Rio +20 outcome statements, we can see that there's actually a variety of different phrases that are used. So we have references, for example, to integrated approaches or to policy coherence, policy integration, stronger interlinkages. And so what we wanted to understand is, well, what does this mean? What does coherence or integration or interlinkages? What does that mean? Because I guess as lawyers, we look to language and textual analysis to say, does this lead to various obligations or commitments from this? I should point out at this stage, we understand that there may well be very good reasons why such language is used in policy and political negotiations, because you want to ensure that you have agreement between all the parties. And we're seeing this obviously in Glasgow with the COP26 at the moment. But we also wanted to drill down to say, well, what actually does it mean in practice? How can we identify the obligations that governments may have in terms of this broader interaction between the three frameworks? So we started by taking a step back and saying, well, what are perhaps some of the dictionary definitions, rather than legal definitions, what are the dictionary definitions of some of these words that are used in these frameworks? And so we looked at, for example, the word coherence, which means a logical and consistent argument or theory. We then looked at integration, so to combine or to be combined into a whole. And so when we started identifying the dictionary definitions, we realized that perhaps integration is the wrong word to use at the international level, because we have these three frameworks. And as Helen mentioned, they may have been negotiated in silos, and that may be a negative. But at the same time, there's very deliberately, it was decided they wouldn't be combined into one instrument. So we don't have one holistic instrument that covers disaster risk, climate adaptation, and sustainable development. So they're not integrated in that sense in terms of creating a whole. So we started looking to say, well, maybe we need to focus on the coherence component. So systemic coherence at the international level is what is required, so that you have a logical and consistent approach between these different frameworks, but recognizing that there are perhaps different actors and different motivations behind the actions that are required from these three frameworks. We then looked at the relationship between the national, the regional, and the international levels, and including within that the sub-regional and the sub-national, because obviously even within states, you can go all the way down to the local level. So what is the relationship between the obligations that may be agreed in Glasgow or Geneva or Paris with what happens on the ground? And once again, using dictionary definitions, we looked and decided the terminology of alignment might actually be the most appropriate one to use here. So talking about arranging in a straight line or into the correct relative positions, thinking there needs to be an alignment between the international, the regional, and the national. So we have systemic coherence at the international level between the different frameworks. We then have vertical alignment between the international, regional, and national. And I'll come back and explain why we also need to look at this from a bottom-up approach, that actually alignment can go from the local, subnational up to the international. And then when we looked at it at the domestic, the national level, we decided actually the word integration was appropriate when we start looking at a national policy and legal framework, that horizontal integration between the policies within a state is the appropriate approach to take, that there should be an attempt to ensure that these are combined into a whole so that you have a coherent and holistic approach being adopted at the national level. So when we started teasing out these different definitions, we decided systemic coherence at the international level, vertical alignment between the different levels, and then horizontal integration at the domestic level. And we started trying to visualize what might this look like, and decided that an hourglass model might actually be the most appropriate way of envisaging this. So it wasn't deliberate. I don't know whether subconsciously we were influenced by the Extinction Rebellion hourglass, but we're viewing it in a slightly different perspective. Thinking about an hourglass obviously can be switched upside down. And this is one of the really important points for us. If we think about the center of the hourglass as a fulcrum, that regional approaches may actually be fundamental. So we're not just talking about top down from the international to the local, but we can switch it round and talk about the local to the international. And we can draw on, for example, Harold Coe, who's talked about the uploading of norms from the domestic level to the international, and then the downloading of international norms from the international to the domestic. So just briefly before I finish, what does this mean in practice? And if we, Tommaso's research, particularly in Fiji and the Pacific Islands, we're able to provide some really good examples of how this is occurring at the domestic level. And particularly if we look at the Fijian National Adaptation Plan, it's quite interesting if you look at the language that's being used within that. So for example, the NAP very explicitly says this NAP has been aligned to support these international agreements. So they use the word alignment. So despite it not coming in any of the international documents, that's the word that's used in the Fijian National Adaptation Plan. Likewise, they define horizontal integration as the mainstreaming of climate change issues into national level development planning processes. So once again, using this concept of horizontal integration at the domestic level within the Fijian National Adaptation Plan. So we're proposing this, this understanding of language to try and have some more precision, because if we use, as Stephen mentioned at the beginning, if we're perhaps talking in cross purposes, if we use all this terminology, but we're using it in different means. So by focusing on coherence, alignment, and integration, to understand this relationship between these three frameworks and their implementation at the domestic level. We hope that this model and the hourglass model that we're proposing is able to provide a bit more precision for governments, decision makers, and others in understanding what those obligations and responsibilities might be. So thank you very much. And like Yairen, I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have. Thanks.
Thanks, Doug. And now moving on to Adam to give us an overview of his chapter. I think you're on mute, Adam.
Excuse me. Thank you very much. I think you can hear me now. Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you to all of you for your concise sort of overviews of your chapters and the opportunity to work together with you on this great volume, looking at the three frameworks of the SDGs, Sendai, and climate change. And thank you to Stephen for bringing me in. It's hard to believe that just a week ago on UN Day, we were both reaching the summit of Kilimanjaro, the highest mountain in Africa, about 5,800 meters above sea level. And from the top of Kilimanjaro, it's like being in an airplane, you're looking down on the earth. And one of the thoughts I had up there is that, all the planet Earth is in and of itself a small island developing state. And if we don't get it right with our resources, our relationship and balance and harmony with the environment, and with our relationship with each other, then the whole island will suffer and may not be able to progress as it should. My chapter looks at something that we all people around the world, that all governments have in common, things they struggle with, and that is eating. What we eat, what we choose to eat, and which areas of food policy governments choose to look at in relation to, before it was just what was possible, what was just possible or what was most effective in getting food to people, and people's food choices expanded. But now it has particular importance in light of the framework of climate change and poverty reduction, food security. All of these issues are interrelated. We're no longer just sitting in a restaurant with a menu by ourselves, but our choices have an impact on those around us immediately, to the extent of our community and people around the world. I have a short PowerPoint I'll throw up just to deal that sort of highlights some of the main points that I bring up in the book. So I'll just share my chapter. It says host disabled participant screen share. Is there a way to get my share screen? I'm not allowed to share the screen, Stephen. If not, I could just.
It should be able to. You can send it to me. Make host. Okay. That should work now, Adam, I think. Try that.
Yep. All right.
Yeah, that's working. Yeah.
And so the framework for the discussion of this chapter is it looks at not at particular food items, but it groups together the impact of mammals and how the sustainable production and the conception of mammals has an effect on both the economy, the environment, and health. And of course, it goes far beyond that, but this is for the purpose of this discussion. That's what it looks at. So on the economic spectrum, the societal costs. One second here. There we go. Move this one to the side. Yeah, the societal cost. The underlying principle, or the sort of thesis for the discussion, is that the societal costs of mammal meat consumption are far greater than the price paid by the consumer, and that's as a result of decisions made on what areas of the economy or what areas of food production that are basically subsidized or externalized by governments. In true cost economics always includes the cost of negative externalities into the pricing of goods and services. So we'll look at that just briefly. When you take 2,500 gallons of water, 12 pounds of grain, 35 pounds of topsoil, and the energy equivalent of a gallon of gasoline to produce just 1 pound of feedloaf beef, then the cost obviously is going to be much higher than that's what's paid for by the consumer in a restaurant or in a grocery store. This figure, you can see briefly that on the left shows the average feed in thousands of calories to produce 1,000 calories consumed by humans. So it's much higher for beef than by pork. And then the gallon in terms of water, irrigation water, which costs a lot of money, often subsidized by government budgets. So the amount of water it takes to produce a pound of beef compared to other food products. These are just a few case study examples. In Des Moines, Iowa, they had to invest public money, $3.7 million build a water treatment facility in another small community in Kansas. They spent $3.5 million. And in Chino, California, they spent $4.6 million to build these water treatment facilities and to clean the water, to clean the phosphates and the nitrogen, the nitrates from the water, from the irrigation water, basically, that had gone through after all of these chemical fertilizers had been used to grow crops that were then fed to cows. There are $200 billion a year in obesity-related healthcare expenses often as a result of eating high amounts of mammal meat like beef and pork. If you factor in the carbon cost of a burger, it would actually cost 53 cents extra. So if we were to factor in the impact on climate change from each burger, it is estimated, and the academic references are all in the chapter. Of course, I didn't put them in the PowerPoint just to save some space. So the question, the hypothetical question is that if we want to eat beef, or those who want to eat beef, is it necessary for others to subsidize it? Or could the money that has been used to subsidize the production of beef be actually channeled to other areas more in line with reducing carbon emissions or more sustainable investments? In which case it would be sort of used just for special occasions. We could have a steak or pork or on a regular basis. Perhaps the rich or those could afford it could eat it on a regular basis. Just because a few people fly around in private planes doesn't mean we all need to fly around in private planes, private jets to get to where we want to go. Some of us fly economy, while others who can afford it can definitely do so. On the environmental front, the Union of Concerned Scientists has ranked the production and consumption of mammal meat as the second most environmentally harmful consumer activity in the world. The first actually is the combustion engine and the burning of fossil fuels to transport us and all our freights and everything around the world is actually the first. So in this case, if you're actually in some part of the world like China that doesn't produce many cows but imports them from Brazil, and if you have a hamburger in Brazil that's been imported using fossil fuels to ship by the cow from Brazil to China, then that's actually like a double whammy in terms of our impact on climate change and the growing incidence of natural weather events. The inefficient farming of cattle feed, together with methane emissions from cows and fertilizers, it creates as much greenhouse gas emissions as all the world's cars, trucks, and airplanes combined. The livestock industry already has degraded 20% of the world's pasture land through overgrazing. Much of this, and increasing amounts of this, are in tropical rainforests where the forests don't really grow back. So like in the Amazon basin, where they're clearing rainforests to grow cows to export to China. Incidentally, beef now is Brazil's #1 export, and the #1 importer of that beef is China, and its economy is growing, and people are choosing and wanting to have that food product on a daily basis. So that's just going in the wrong direction. We're losing 80,000 acres of tropical rainforest every day. And the #1 reason for that is beef. Soy products, palm oil, and wood products also are other reasons. So finding a solution to that, or an alternative, is paramount and critical to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals, and then reducing the weather disasters, and thereby having an impact on Sunday. Overusing limited freshwater resources, as well as creating vast oceanic dead zones from the nitrogen and phosphorus runoffs that come from chemical fertilizers. So this is a brief image here showing the Gulf of Mexico and the coastline, around Texas and in Louisiana, that used to have a thriving seafood industry, which has now long gone because the nitrogen and phosphorus runoffs go into the Gulf of Mexico. They create these algae blooms that suck all the oxygen out of the water and then kill all the fish and the seafood. And they all come, running down the Mississippi from the heartland where all this intensive agriculture is underway to feed the cattle industry primarily. Also in the environment, 90% of the world's marine stocks have now been deployed or overexploited. All 17 of the world's major fishing areas have been reached or have reached or exceeded their natural limits. And through my research that's cited also in the chapter, I discovered that over 30 million tons, about 30% of all fish taken from the oceans, is actually used to feed livestock, which is rather shocking for me. I didn't know that before. They feed the livestock industry. Basically, they can feed the cows. A lot of it's crops that are grown or purchased, but even excess candy from a lot of the candy factories is also they feed basically anything they can get to grow the cows. So on the health front, we have SDG 3. It is well known that people who eat 4 ounces of mammal meat a day, such as beef or pork, are more likely to die of cancer or heart disease. The sons of beef-eating mothers are found to have 1/3 of the sperm concentration than mothers who don't eat beef. And men who eat more than 2 red meat servings daily. I mean, those of us who are listening to this probably could imagine, well, having a steak for lunch and dinner. But if you combine that with sausage and bacon at breakfast, it can lead to 28% risk of having a stroke. Also related to diabetes, the World Health Organization has labeled processed mammal meat as a type 1 carcinogen, as bad for you as cigarettes. If it's just a steak or pork that hasn't been processed, it's still a carcinogen, but it's a type 2 carcinogen. People who ate chicken or turkey each day instead of beef or pork had a 13% reduced stroke risk over those who ate 1 daily serving of mammal. And incidentally, shifting from primarily beef and reducing beef and increasing if someone wants to eat meat. Of course, if a vegan or a vegetarian, they don't have to worry about this, but simply shifting from beef or reducing the beef and increasing turkey, say, has a very fast effect on human health and can reduce the risks of stroke and diabetes. Often also in the industrial production of this beef around the world, and we're not talking about, say, grass-fed cattle in Switzerland is much better for you. If you're hunting game meat, it's much better for you, much better for you. But these cows that are produced on these large farms and where they're used a lot of antibiotics, there's a lot of study, a lot of research going into the effect that's having in building antibiotic resistance in humans. So despite clear health implications of eating mammal meat, the industry actually says we're not eating enough. So I reviewed a lot of research from the beef and pork industries. And so the National American Meat Institute has estimated that on average, Americans consume men about 4.8 ounces of meat, meaning pork or beef, a day, whereas women it's a little bit lower at 3.13. But they're saying we should actually increase that and eat. We should be at 5.7. So women need to nearly double their beef intake, and men need to increase by about 50% to reach what they're saying is a daily meat consumption. I wholeheartedly disagree, based on the other research that I've done, and some of which I've just cited. A few of the conclusions, and from the chapter, a lot of it is taken from a book of mine that was published a couple of years ago called the No Mammal Manifesto, Diet for a New and More Sustainable World. And so the conclusions also are in this book, is that we need to be more conscious of the origin and the impact of our dietary decisions as individuals, but also governments in designing food policy. Americans themselves have reduced their beef consumption by 19%, whereas other countries it's actually going up. On an individual level, the book and chapter recommends if we can't go cold turkey, sort of an English Anglo-Saxon pun, meaning making a complete and immediate change, we can reduce. We can treat meat as a flavoring or a special occasion food, but not as a center of attraction of every meal. Meaning not with a steak with a few vegetables and potatoes on the side. Trying a turkey burger, for those who say they must eat hamburgers, turkey burgers, or even better, a Beyond Beef burger or Impossible Whopper. The veggie burgers can actually be more satisfying. Insect bug burgers, it talks about lab-grown clean meat, hold the cheese if it has rennet, and pet food, read the ingredients. An amazing amount of mammal meats, usually some of these describes, but beef and pork are actually fed to animals, to our pets. And then we can sort of look at that and look for alternatives. Expanding our horizon of the amazing of 30,000 available and edible plant species on Earth. Individuals and governments consider investing in and expanding some of the other ones that aren't actually consumed or that are not on the mainstream menu, but there are so much more we could explore. So we need to support sound government policies that encourage healthy food choices and ensure access to nutritious food. What we decide to put on our school menus, public schools, there are a lot of billions of dollars in most countries that are spent on public school systems, and then the food that we feed to the children. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Adam. And now we'll open it up to a few questions. We're going to keep these brief as we're running close to time. First of all, I have a couple of questions for each of the authors, which I'll start with, and if each of you can give an answer to, and then we'll open it up to the floor. If people can type their questions in the Q&A box, please. So first of all, this book makes the case to integrate the Sustainable Development Goals, climate change adaptation, and disaster risk reduction to increase societal resilience, which is a laudable aim. If each of the speakers today were to recommend 3 clear steps to focus on in order to achieve this aim, what would they be? And Stephen, I'll start with you.
Hi, Sarah, I'm on mute there. So 3 clear steps. I think it kind of echoes the chapters and what we've been discussing today. So I think a lot of it is looking at common use of language. I think use of data and availability of data, so we can actually count what we're looking at, and that's across developed and developing world. And then I think it's just this kind of mindset of working, of looking across disciplines and working across disciplines and not getting stuck in this kind of siloed approach, which is easier said than done. But maybe the spirit of this book is that people are working together, and I think the kind of continuing that spirit is a way to go. So I'll just keep it brief. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. And Yairen, the same question to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I would say that talking with and learning from people who live in vulnerable communities, not only in other countries, in other territories, but in our own territories where we live currently. For instance, in Ireland, people from the small islands around Ireland, people who live in coastal communities, people who might have a very different approach to vulnerability from those of us who live in more centric spaces. That's something we can do as citizens, as researchers, as practitioners. Another thing is to look at climate vulnerability from an intersectional perspective. And this means paying attention to how different categories such as gender, ethnic background, race, socioeconomic status affect race as a constructed category, as it was here, affect people's vulnerability, and how the vulnerability, environmental vulnerability connects with other forms of social vulnerability. And finally, to keep it brief, engaging with scholars and practitioners from underrepresented communities, always double checking if what we are proposing as groundbreaking theory and practice has not been already proposed by someone who is in an underrepresented condition that does not allow that to be properly acknowledged. And always try to acknowledge if that's the case. Engaging with people, and I'm talking here again about Black scholars, people of color, LGBT, people from the LGBTQ community, people from these disability communities too. People who sometimes might find barriers to join the conversation. Barriers are created by historical injustices that are also framing climate change, sustainable development, and disaster risk. Thank you.
Thanks. And the same question for Doug.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. And my first response might actually perhaps answer one of Gail's questions I see in the Q&A, is in terms of what advice would we give to the leaders in the COP. I think the first thing is we need to be ambitious, but we also need to implement the existing agreements. That it's very easy to have new words said and new commitments, but actually we need to live up to what's been said, both as states, as Western states, as polluting states, and as individuals. So that would be my first point. I think we need to implement what we've already agreed. The second point really, I think, reflects what Stephen and Yairen have been saying, is this breaking down of barriers. And once again, the silos that we have between disciplines and between different communities, different states, different groups, is something that we all need to work on individually ourselves. I mean, it's very easy to be stuck in your own discipline, whether as an academic or a practitioner. So I think it's incumbent on ourselves to try and break down some of these barriers. I think that's probably only 2, but I'll maybe leave it at that. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Doug. And Adam, the same question for you too.
I would say, to question my assumptions that I put forth in the chapter, and to inform yourself. Everyone should inform themselves inform themselves of the impact of their dietary decisions and the subsidies of their governments. What very few of us know how our tax revenues are spent, and which ones are spent, and how the petroleum industry, the carbon-based fossil fuel industry, is subsidized, how the energy choices are subsidized, how our food choices are subsidized. And so becoming aware of that is very important. Exploring alternatives to the foods. If we do eat a lot of meat, explore the alternatives. If we do eat meat, to make sure that it's grown sustainably. That encourages those industries that produce those food products. But eat more, eat less mammal meat if it's possible, and more if there's meat, eating more seafood, turkey, chicken, vegetables, etc., things that are good for us. To share with others is sort of a third point. To sharing with, inviting friends over, having meals like this and having discussions with them. And just, it's not like I'm a vegan, you're a meat eater kind of thing. It's not us versus them, but it's all about us. There's no us and them, really. There's only us on this planet. And then lastly, in closing, I'd like to say that I hope the menus at COP26 are sustainable. I hope that the food items on there are sustainable. If there are hamburgers or steaks, that they've been grown sustainably in Switzerland or in Scotland or someplace where they're doing it correctly. And that message gets across, that this is something that we can all take part in. It's a solution that each of us can be involved in, because quite often we hear all this news about climate change and the disasters and all of that. It becomes overwhelming. What can I do as an individual? What can I do? And very few people really, really can feel that they can take action. Or we look at, we see the activists out there doing something, but most of us kind of feel overwhelmed and we're at home. And something that we all can do is just choose our meals more wisely and consciously and sustainably. And it's very important, has a massive impact when each and every one of us are taking action with our dietary decisions. That's what I'd like to close. Thank you.
Actually, on that point, Adam, there is a question in the Q&A about how do we get children involved and how do we get children, how to feed kids without mammal meat, to start planet-friendly diets young. Toby mentions that his kids really love their chicken nuggets, pork sausages, and beef burgers. So that's quite a good question for the next generation.
Yeah, especially once they've started. I think if they're started on beef, my children have I never eaten mammals. I have 3 kids, but chicken nuggets, they eat a lot of chicken nuggets. Chickens aren't mammals and have a much lower impact on the planet. There are a lot of beef substitutes these days from like Beyond Burger, and they're getting better and better. And there's even some products that are being grown in the lab now. There's more and more of this sort of looking at the molecular level of beef and trying to grow it in the lab. I don't know if that research will go very far, but moving the taste away from it eventually. But if they need a hamburger, having a turkey burgers taste just as good as beef burgers. Or Beyond Burgers, going completely off into these veggie burgers that are much more like beef than they used to be. But ideally, if it's not too late, for those people out there who don't the children are still young, is to don't start them off on steaks and beefs. Start them. In my opinion, it's better to go with the non-mammal. If it's a turkey or chicken, some people have the opinion it's better just to raise them as vegetarians. I have a sister, nieces who've never eaten any kind of meat. They've grown up as vegans, and they've got the gold medals in their track and field competitions at high school all the time. They're super strong, super fast, super smart, and they've never eaten any beef or mammal products, or actually any animal products at all. So that's kind of the answer for that. It's kind of work gently with them and shift them away from and have those discussions with them. Children naturally become more vegetarian once they know where the food is coming from. In our society, often we will raise a cow in one of these industrial farms, and they cut it up and they wrap it in cellophane plastic wrap. It goes into the grocery store, and we pick it up without any conscious connection with the animal itself. And so I think we're just becoming more aware of the whole issue. We can make better decisions. It's very important for the children to be aware and to talk about it with them, from the impact from what it is for the animal, what it is for the animal being raised, or what it is for the impact on climate change. Once we agree on the science and we really look into it, I have many friends who have they bought my book, the No Mammal Manifesto, and they've admitted to me they don't want to read it because they're afraid that if they read it, they will, they'll shift their diet, and their diet is so important to them. But it's ignorance is no longer an excuse. I think it's important to educate ourselves, to be aware, and to make the decisions on an individual level.
Thanks.
That's important, yeah.
Thanks, Adam. And we're coming up close on time now, but I will just ask one last question. We touched a bit on the fact that COP26 is taking place, and as we see the world leaders gather for the climate meetings, what do you think is the best way to generate the political will that's needed for the level of social transformation necessary to shift onto a path of resilience, sustainability, and away from the current trajectory towards runaway climate change? Stephen, if you want to kick it off, and appreciate if everybody can keep it quite brief as we are running close to time.
I'll keep it brief too. So yeah, to get that political will, I think it really is, from my perspective, is raising more awareness and more conversations in the general population, and also with I guess with practitioners and those interested in the topic, and that making that voice heard and represented in the ballot box as well. That's the only way we're going to actually move that needle in terms of what our politicians prioritize. So I guess what I'm calling for is kind of bottom up approaches. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to be very brief too. I will just, steal the words, some words by Elizabeth Batuti, who is a youth activist who spoke at COP26, and she says she asked people to open their hearts. And this might sound that as very easy to do, but it's actually quite challenging. And it connects with a lot of even research on the importance of linking affect and reason to face the many crises we are facing, and to learning from the epistemologists from the South. Boaventura de Sousa Santos talks about thinking, feeling, to connect what we do and what we rationally construct to our material and emotional circumstances. So I would say that, and very briefly, I would address Tushar Pradhan question on African countries and the challenge of achieving disaster risk reduction. I think that there are lots of connections between African territories and the Caribbean, and there are some lessons there on the Caribbean risk management initiative that could be integrated. And I'm sure that the Caribbean has learned and still learning a lot from African countries. Also, we are part of the diaspora, the African diaspora, no? And in this regard, just to try to look at triangulation and reparations and a framework of reparations and capacity building. The human capital is there, is in these territories. There is what is needed is investment, and that's achieved through triangulation with richer territories. So I just wanted to highlight that. Thank you.
Thanks. And Doug, I know you touched on COP26 before, but if you have anything to add to that as well.
Well, obviously, I have no magic solutions, but I'd agree with what everyone else has said. I think the one thing, perhaps unsurprisingly, as a lawyer, what I'd also add in is accountability. And I think that we need to have accountability for our elected representatives, our governments, what they do both at home and abroad, for corporations. And that's not necessarily just legal accountability. It may well be that we have the Friends of Ireland case here in Ireland. We have the Irena case or the Shell case in the Netherlands. So there may well be legal accountability, but it's also social accountability, political accountability. How do we ensure that people live up to what they're saying they are going to do, so that we don't just have greenwashing by politicians or companies? So I guess accountability and, as I said, implementation would be two things I'd stress. Thanks.
Thanks, Doug. And Adam, do you have something to say to the leader?
I agree with especially Stephen, but also with what Doug just said. And it's a bottom-up approach. I think everyone should be aware of what the issues are, and how their representatives are engaging with those issues. It shouldn't be a left or right position politically. If you're on one particular side, voting or associated with that party, and a representative of that party actually pulls out of an international climate change agreement, then stop support for that guy, because this is and it's like COVID, climate change and the disasters. They affect everybody across the board. And I'm sure many people on the right are as concerned as those on the left. But we need to hold and stop seeing it as a left-right sort of issue, and then hold our representatives accountable. And then when we elect them as well, democracy doesn't stop at the ballot box. It goes far beyond. We need to hold the representatives accountable, writing letters. Most political representatives, they view one letter as like something like 70 or 100 votes. I can't remember the exact ratio, but they pay attention when they start getting a lot of letters. and just let them know that this is a serious issue that we're concerned about. We're talking about the lives and the livelihoods of our children and their children. And so we need to stay involved with our policymakers, but in a way that's engaging, that's non-confrontational, that's non-violent. We need so that they listen to us on both sides of the party. And so there shouldn't be, we need to move beyond sort of the party approach, the left versus right approach in various countries. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Adam, and thanks everybody for their contributions today. I'll hand it back over to Stephen just to close out the event. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, thanks everyone for all your contributions towards the book, towards today's event, the time you've put in terms of all the editors have been involved in this book. There's been many hours and many emails and many conversations to get to release the book and publish it. And I'm very, very proud of everyone who's contributed. I think it's a really important message, a timely message, and I'm really looking forward now post this event to really promoting it and using the chapters and been, as I say again, that word, proud that we contributed to something that that will hopefully be very, very useful, and other scholars and researchers and practitioners and folks will find useful as well. So I'd like to thank everybody who's involved today, and the funders as well, importantly, the Irish Environmental Protection Agency and the Interreg funders in terms of the open access funding. So yeah, thank you very much to everybody. And yep, I'll close out the event, and we will make it available as a recording as well. And we may have other launches going forward in the future, potentially a North American launch. So watch this space. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Bye, bye, bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.